At dawn, the sun's rays creep across the Sahara and strike the facade of a colossal temple on the Nile's west bank. Twice each year, this sunrise penetrates deep into the mountain, illuminating statues of gods and pharaohs in a hidden sanctuary. For over 3,000 years, such moments have displayed the ingenuity and grandeur of the Abu Simbel temples, built by the ancient Egyptian King Ramesses II. But in the 1960s, this timeless ritual and the very survival of the temples was in jeopardy. A modern engineering project was underway upstream, one that would create a massive artificial lake and threaten to swallow these monuments forever. What followed was a race against time, an unprecedented international effort to literally move mountains, or at least a mountain of rock-cut temples, to save a pharaoh's legacy from a watery grave. This is the remarkable true story of the relocation of the Abu Simbel temples, a tale of ancient glory, modern ambition, and engineering genius. Our story begins in the 13th century BCE, when Pharaoh Ramesses II, also known as Ramesses the Great, ruled Egypt. Ramesses II was famed for his building spree, erecting statues, obelisks, and temples on a colossal scale to celebrate his reign and divine status. At Abu Simbel, in Egypt's southern region of Nubia, near the border of modern Sudan, he commissioned two tremendous rock-cut temples. These were carved directly into a sandstone cliff on the west bank of the Nile, around Ramesses' year 24, circa 1265 BCE. The location was strategic. Nubia was rich in gold and resources, and by building monumental temples here, Ramesses aimed to impress upon the Nubians the might of Egypt and its gods. The larger of the twin temples, often called the Great Temple, was dedicated to the gods Amun-Ra, Ra-Horikti, Ptah, and to Ramesses II himself, reflecting the pharaoh's view of himself as a living deity. Its facade stands 21 meters, 70 feet tall, fronted by four colossal statues of a seated Ramesses II wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. Each of these statues is about 20 meters high, as tall as a 5-story building, demonstrating the king's colossal power. By Ramesses' feet, smaller statues of his family, Queen Nefertari and their children, are carved, symbolizing their relative importance. Inside the Great Temple, through a series of grand halls lined with pillars carved as giant Osiris figures of Ramesses, lies the innermost sanctuary. Here sit 4 statues, 3 of Egypt's great gods and one of Ramesses himself, all carved from the mountain's solid rock. In an astonishing feat of ancient engineering and astronomy, the temple was precisely oriented so that twice a year, on or around February 21 and October 21, the rising sun's light would travel through the temple's entrance and halls to illuminate these sanctuary statues. Except for Ptah, the god of darkness, who fittingly remained in shadow. These dates are thought to mark Ramesses II's birthday and coronation day. The alignment underlines how Ramesses wanted his legacy literally in line with cosmic forces. The smaller temple at Abu Simbel, a few dozen meters away, was dedicated to Queen Nefertari, deified as the goddess Hathor, a rare honor for a queen to have a temple of equal artistry next to the pharaohs. Its facade features 6 10-meter statues of Ramesses and Nefertari of equal height, an extraordinary depiction of the royal couple's bond. For centuries after the fall of pharaohs, the Abu Simbel temples were gradually lost to the sands. By the 6th century BCE, desert dunes had covered the Great Temple statues up to their knees. The temples were forgotten to the outside world until 1813, when Swiss explorer Johann Ludwig Burckhardt identified the site. Local people had always known of it, calling it after a boy named Abu Simbel who led explorers there. In 1817, the adventurer Giovanni Belzoni cleared the entrance of the Great Temple, revealing Ramesses' gigantic statues once more. Abu Simbel soon became one of Egypt's most iconic ancient sites, but little did anyone suspect that, 150 years after its rediscovery, Abu Simbel would require an engineering marvel almost as audacious as its original construction to ensure its survival. In the mid-20th century, Egypt embarked on a bold modernization plan that would have enormous implications for Abu Simbel. Following the Egyptian Revolution of 1952, President Gamal Abdel Nasser prioritized economic development and sought to harness the Nile River, the lifeblood of Egypt, for greater hydroelectric power and year-round irrigation. The idea was to build a new, larger dam at Aswan, upstream of the old British-built dam, to control the Nile's annual floods and provide electricity and water for agriculture on an unprecedented scale. This project, known as the Aswan High Dam, was to be one of the largest engineering projects of its time. Construction began in 1960 and would continue throughout the decade, with Soviet technical and financial assistance until the dam's completion in 1970. The High Dam, rising 111 meters high and 3.5 kilometers across, would hold back the Nile to form a huge reservoir spanning over 500 kilometers, over 300 miles up the valley. A reservoir later named Lake Nasser, after President Nasser himself. While the dam promised prosperity, preventing destructive floods, irrigating new farmland, and generating abundant electricity, it also came with a massive environmental and cultural cost. The creation of Lake Nasser meant flooding the entire Nubian Valley upstream, inundating countless villages and displacing over 100,000 Nubian people who had lived along the Nile for generations. Moreover, the rising waters threatened to submerge dozens of ancient temples, tombs, and archaeological sites. The collective heritage of Nubia, including the magnificent temples of Abu Simbel and the island temple of Philae. By 1959, it was clear that once the High Dam was finished, Abu Simbel would be under some 60 meters over 180 feet of water, utterly unreachable and eventually destroyed by erosion and water damage. The stakes were stark. Egypt's push for progress put some of its most treasured historical monuments in peril. As one observer later summarized, development at Aswan presented a dilemma of progress versus preservation, a theme that would resonate around the world. Egyptian authorities faced an agonizing choice. The High Dam was essential for the country's future, but losing Abu Simbel and other sites would be an irreversible cultural tragedy. In a bid to save these antiquities, in 1959, Egypt and Sudan appealed to the international community for help. The call was clear. If nothing was done, within a few years the temples would disappear beneath the waters of Lake Nasser. The world was confronted with an unprecedented challenge. Could modern engineering save ancient engineering? It was, quite literally, now or never. Responding to Egypt's plea, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, stepped forward to coordinate an international rescue mission. On 8 March 1960, at UNESCO's headquarters in Paris, the Director General Vittorino Veronese officially launched the international campaign to save the monuments of Nubia. In his appeal to member nations, Veronese struck an urgent tone. It is now or never that these splendid temples must be saved. The message was unmistakable. Humanity had a shared responsibility to preserve these treasures of our past, or else stand by as they vanished. UNESCO's campaign was unprecedented in scale and became a landmark in the history of global cultural cooperation. Dozens of countries, eventually over 50 nations, answered the call, contributing expertise and funds to the rescue effort. Fundraising drives were held worldwide. School children donated coins, governments pledged support, and national committees were formed to aid the cause. The total cost of the Nubian rescue operation would reach around 80 million in 1960s US dollars, roughly half of which was raised by the international community and half by Egypt. It was a remarkable show of solidarity. French Culture Minister André Malraux praised UNESCO's bold plan as a kind of Tennessee Valley Authority of Archaeology, a grand cooperation project for cultural preservation, and declared the effort historic because through it, the first world civilization publicly proclaims the world's art as its indivisible heritage. In other words, for the first time, nations around the globe were uniting to save not just someone else's heritage, but our shared human heritage. Saving Abu Simbel was the flagship goal of the campaign, but the effort ultimately encompassed 22 monuments and architectural complexes in Nubia. Temples large and small were documented, dismantled, and moved to new locations. Archaeologists raced to conduct salvage excavations in areas to be flooded, uncovering new finds before the waters rose. In a few cases, entire temples were gifted to donor nations as thanks. For example, the small temple of Denda now resides in New York's Metropolitan Museum, and the Temple of Debode in Madrid. But Abu Simbel, with its sheer scale and symbolic importance, posed the greatest challenge and captured the world's imagination. Newspapers called the impending relocation a race against time and a rescue operation like no other. The task was daunting. How do you move two massive temples carved into a mountainside weighing tens of thousands of tons? Could it be done before the rising Nile engulfed them? From the outset, engineers and archaeologists realized that saving Abu Simbel would require innovative solutions at the very edge of what was thought possible. Numerous proposals were considered. One radical idea, devised by engineer William McQuitty and architects Jane Drew and Maxwell Fry, suggested building a transparent underwater dome around the temples, effectively turning Abu Simbel into an underwater museum in situ. Visitors would have viewed the temples through glass underwater chambers, while the waters of the Lake Nasser rose around them. As imaginative as this concept was, it was ultimately deemed too risky and impractical. Another proposal imagined constructing a dam or cofferdam around the site to hold back the water permanently. Still, others suggested simply dismantling the temples stone by stone and reconstructing them elsewhere, a Herculean task, but perhaps the most feasible. After intense study, the decision was made to physically cut the temples out of the mountain and reassemble them on higher ground. This plan was bold and unprecedented, but it had the advantage of preserving the monuments in their entirety, as opposed to leaving them underwater and in an authentic setting near their original location. The chosen new site was a rocky plateau 65 meters higher in elevation and some 180 to 210 meters back, northwest from the river, above the projected high water line of the future lake. Essentially, the temples would be moved up and away from the water, and an artificial hill would be built there to recreate the original setting. Planning this move was a colossal endeavor. First, a cofferdam had to be built around Abu Simbel to protect it from the Nile's rapidly rising waters while work was ongoing. By 1964, the Aswan High Dam had progressed enough that the Nile's flooding in Nubia was imminent. Engineers rushed to construct a temporary 370-meter-long, 25-meter-high cofferdam of sand, rock, and steel around the temples. The barrier held back the water and kept the site dry, buying precious time to perform the rescue. Next came the exhaustive surveying and documentation. Experts from around the world measured every statue, every carving, every wall relief of the temples with meticulous care. They created detailed maps and models of the site. This was essential to ensure that after relocation, the temples could be reassembled in exactly the same layout and orientation. The alignment was especially critical. The Great Temple needed to face precisely the same direction to maintain its biannual solar illumination event. Astronomers and surveyors collaborated to calculate the new positioning so that the sun would continue to align with the sanctuary on the same days, within a close margin to the original dates. In fact, the reassembled temple's axis was so carefully plotted that the sun effect today occurs just one day off the original days, a virtually identical result. With plans in place, teams prepared the temple surfaces for cutting by marking out block divisions along the walls and facade, choosing cut lines that would be the least visible when patched up later. It was like mapping out a giant 3D jigsaw puzzle to be taken apart and put back together. In November 1963, with Lake Nasser's waters steadily rising, the painstaking demolition of the Abu Simbel temples began. This was no wanton destruction, but rather a surgical deconstruction. Engineers, builders, and stonecutters from Egypt and dozens of other countries worked side by side, often literally by hand, to carve the site into movable blocks. Heavy machinery and explosives were mostly forbidden. Any excessive vibration or errant blast could crack the ancient sandstone or damage the intricate carvings on the walls. Thus, the work was often slow and manual. Workers used jackhammers, chisels, and handsaws, as well as innovative rock-cutting tools like diamond-tipped wire saws, to slice the great statues and temple halls into manageable sections. Each cut had to be precise. The blocks were enormous, on average 20 tons each, some up to 30 tons, and irregularly shaped according to what portion of the temple they held. In total, the Great Temple and the Small Temple were cut into over 1,000 pieces. The often cited figure is about 1,030 blocks. Imagine the scene. One moment tourists and inspectors are gazing up at the majestic seated statues of Ramesses II, the next, engineers have drawn cutting lines right across the pharaoh's colossal chest and crown. It was undoubtedly heartbreaking for archaeologists to cut through a masterpiece of antiquity. Yet, it was the only way to save it. Each block was carefully numbered and catalogued so its exact original position was known. Workers reinforced certain delicate sections with temporary supports. The interior ceilings and walls were even braced with a special reinforced concrete frame before cutting, to ensure they wouldn't collapse once separated from the surrounding rock. Piece by piece, statues were decapitated and sectioned, walls were cut into slabs, and the mountain that held the temple was dismantled. Giant cranes then lifted the blocks out of their original locations. Some sections, like the face of one of the fallen colossi that had collapsed in antiquity, were left as they were found. The broken pieces of that statue were also relocated, but kept in their fallen arrangement as before. By 1965, Abu Simbel had been completely taken apart, a surreal sight. Over 1,000 pieces of an ancient puzzle lay in storage areas nearby, awaiting transport. Conveying these massive blocks from the original site to the new location on the plateau was another challenge. Roads and ramps were built to move the blocks using trucks and trailers capable of bearing dozens of tons. The logistics were staggering, but compared to the delicate cutting, moving the chunks of temple was relatively straightforward, if laborious. A multinational crew of roughly 2,000 workers, engineers, crane operators, stonemasons, and labourers toiled in the unforgiving desert heat to haul every piece up to the plateau. This truly was, as some journalists called it, an engineering miracle in the desert. It wasn't just the raw manpower that impressed, it was the precision and care. As one account noted, cuts were made where they would be least conspicuous, and reassembling would use special mortar so that, today, it is impossible to see where the joins were made. In essence, the team treated the ancient monument as if it were priceless art, which it was, performing a conservation operation on a titanic scale. With the blocks of Abu Simbel safely moved to the high plateau, the next phase was like playing giant architectural Lego, reconstructing the temples exactly as they had been, but in a new location. To achieve this, the engineers first had to create a mountain on the plateau. Since originally the temples were embedded in a hillside, they had to recreate a similar environment. The solution was to build a huge artificial dome structure for each temple, which would then be covered with rocks and sand to mimic a natural hill. For the Great Temple, a dome of reinforced concrete was constructed, spanning the interior like a hidden vault. For the small temple of Nefertari, a smaller concrete dome was made. These domes and supporting arches would hold up the tons of rock piled on top, ensuring that the reassembled temples would be structurally supported and protected, while also allowing an empty cavity inside for the temple chambers. In effect, the temple's new home was a giant hollow mountain built by modern means, a protective shell into which the ancient blocks could be mounted in their original configuration. Reassembly began with placing the blocks of the sanctuary and inner halls, then working outward. Over the course of 1966 to 1968, block after block was put back together using cranes and an intricate positioning system. Thanks to the earlier surveys and numbering, each piece fit into its predetermined spot. Workers sealed the joints between blocks with a special mortar made of cement mixed with local desert sand, closely matching the colour and texture of the sandstone. In some cases, where the saw cuts left a gap, the team used new advanced techniques like injecting resins and epoxy to bind the ancient stone together and fill voids. The result was so seamless that, once complete, a casual visitor would hardly notice the temples had been cut at all. The cracks were practically invisible to the eye. Special care was given to preserving the exact orientation of the temples. The new artificial hills were laid out so that the facades of the temples faced the same direction relative to the sun as before. Surveyors double-checked that the axis alignment was true, and indeed, in the years after Reconstruction, observers confirmed that on the designated mornings in February and October, the sun's rays still pierced the Great Temple's length and illuminated the sanctuary statues almost exactly as they did in Ramesses' day, only shifted by a single day due to the slight difference in position. This was a significant triumph. The magical solar alignment was preserved for future generations to witness, despite the entire temple having been relocated like a gigantic jigsaw puzzle. By September 1968, the project was essentially finished. On 22 September 1968, Abu Simbel was officially inaugurated at its new location with much fanfare. dignitaries and officials from around the world gathered to celebrate the successful salvation of the temples. The towering statues of Ramesses II once again gazed proudly over the Nile, now Lake Nasser's waters glistening in the distance. As if nothing had changed, even though they were now perched atop an artificial cliff built by modern hands. The smaller temple of Nefertari stood likewise reassembled nearby, her statue and those of Ramesses just as they had been. It was hard to believe these monuments had been cut into thousands of pieces only a few years before. As one onlooker noted, the entire complex looked as though it had always been there on that cliff, a testament to the skill and care of the restoration teams. The massive international effort had paid off. Abu Simbel was saved. The relocation of the Abu Simbel temples remains one of the greatest feats of archaeological engineering ever accomplished. It was a triumph not only of technology and logistics, but of international cooperation and commitment to shared heritage. Never before had so many nations come together to save cultural monuments on another nation's soil. This groundbreaking campaign proved the concept that world heritage is a collective responsibility. In fact, the success at Abu Simbel directly inspired broader efforts to protect cultural sites globally. It paved the way for UNESCO's World Heritage Convention, signed in 1972, which today safeguards hundreds of natural and cultural sites around the world. In a very real sense, Abu Simbel's rescue was the seed of the international World Heritage movement. For Egypt, the salvaging of Abu Simbel was a point of national pride and international gratitude. And thanks to UNESCO and countless engineers, donors, and workers from around the globe, Abu Simbel and other Nubian monuments were saved from the floodwaters. In recognition of this collaborative victory, Egypt presented 4 rescued temples as gifts to countries that contributed significantly: the United States, Spain, Italy, and the Netherlands. But the greatest gift was arguably the example set by the project itself. Today, visitors to Abu Simbel, often arriving by bus or by a small plane to a nearby airstrip built for the project, can hardly imagine that the great statues of Ramesses II were once dismantled and moved. The temples sit majestically against what appears to be a natural cliffside, and only a closer inspection or a read of the plaques reveals the incredible journey they undertook. Tourists still gather at dawn on the biannual dates to witness the sun illuminating the sanctuary, a moving experience that connects them with the intentions of ancient priests and architects over 3 millennia ago. As the sunlight strikes the stone faces of gods and king deep inside the mountain, one can't help but reflect on the human ingenuity across ages, from the original Pharaonic builders to the modern engineers that made such a moment possible.
Remember to hit the subscribe button and ring that bell to stay updated with our latest content. And while you're here, why not check out another one of our exciting videos? Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.